The soldier came home after 40 years to find that his first love had never stopped waiting. The taxi hissed to a stop, its brakes sighing like a man giving up a ghost. For Staff Sergeant Elias Vance, the sound was the first real punctuation mark at the end of a sentence that had lasted 4 decades. The air that seeped through the open window was thick with the smell of damp soil and pine, the scent of home. It was a universe away from the recycled, sterile air of transport planes and the dry, mineral tang of dust that had been his constant companion. He paid the driver with crisp, unfamiliar bills, his movements stiff and economical. He swung the olive-drab duffel bag from the trunk onto his shoulder. It was heavy, but its weight was a comfort. It was a known quantity, a physical burden he could understand. The other burdens, the ones that had no mass and no shape, were far heavier. He stood on the curb of Maple Street. 40 years. A lifetime. The Jacobsons' prize-winning roses were gone, replaced by a lawn of unnerving perfection. His own family's home had been sold twice. He knew that much from the terse government debriefing. It was just a house now, a container for other people's lives. But Clara's house, that was the real destination. That was the magnetic north his compass had been pointing toward through 40 years of darkness. He hadn't sent word. How could he? What words could possibly bridge such a chasm of time? Dear Clara, the reports of my death were, it turns out, merely delayed. It was absurd. He turned the final corner, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. And there it was. Number 214. He stopped dead. Something was wrong. No, not wrong. It was impossible. The house was exactly as he remembered it. The pale blue shutters, the porch swing hanging from 2 perfectly straight chains, the white picket fence that still had the one slat that was slightly shorter than the rest. It was not a house that had aged 40 years. It was a house that had been preserved in amber. The lawn was meticulously manicured. The flower beds beneath the windows were full of the same marigolds she had always loved, their orange and yellow faces bright in the afternoon sun. There was no sign of another life here. No unfamiliar car in the driveway. No children's toys scattered on the grass. There was only a profound and unsettling stillness, as if the entire property was holding its breath. He approached the porch steps, his training kicking in, analyzing the scene. This wasn't neglect, it was the opposite. It was a level of maintenance that bordered on obsession. A shrine. He felt a cold dread snake its way up his spine, colder than any fear he had known in the field. The life he had dreamed of, the one where she had moved on, found happiness, maybe even had a family, that reality would have been painful. This was terrifying. His knuckles hovered over the solid wood of the front door. He could feel the grain of the paint, could see the faint reflection of his own tired, aged face in the brass door knocker. He was an old man. What was he even doing here? He was about to turn away, to retreat back into the anonymous world that had been his home, when the door opened. She stood there. Her hair was a cloud of silver, her face a delicate map of fine lines, but her eyes were the same. The same deep, startling blue that had captivated him when he was 18 years old. They widened, first in confusion, then in a dawning recognition that was so profound it seemed to cause her physical pain. Her hand, frail and spotted with age, flew to her mouth. A small, choked sound escaped her lips. It was not a cry of joy. It was the sound of a 40-year-old dam finally breaking. Elias, she whispered, the name a fragile artifact excavated from the deep past. The blood drained from his face. The strength went out of his legs, and he had to grip the porch railing to keep from collapsing. The duffel bag, his familiar weight, slid from his shoulder and landed with a heavy thud on the wooden planks. The shock was not that she was here. The shock was the look in her eyes, the look of a sentry who had never, not for one single day, left her post. He hadn't returned to a life that had moved on. He had returned to a life that had stopped. They stood there for an eternity, 2 statues on a porch, the space between them humming with the ghosts of 40 lost years. He saw it all in that moment, the crushing weight of her vigil, the impossible burden of her loyalty. He had survived his prison. He was not sure he could survive this. She eventually led him inside. The interior of the house confirmed his fears. It was a museum of 1983. The floral sofa was the same, protected by a clear plastic cover. The framed photos on the mantelpiece were of him in his crisp army uniform, of the two of them at their high school prom, their faces impossibly young and full of a future that never happened. Dust was absent. Everything was clean, cared for, preserved. A mausoleum for a life that should have been. They sat in the living room, a vast space of silence between them on the couch. "They told me, they said you were gone," she said, her voice raspy with disuse, as if she hadn't spoken of this to anyone in decades. "I was," Elias replied, his own voice a low gravel. "In a manner of speaking. But you're here," it wasn't a question. It was a statement of bewildered fact, as if she were touching a phantom to see if it was solid. He couldn't explain the black sights, the years of interrogation, the decades spent in a concrete box where the only calendar was the changing of the guards. The words wouldn't come. All he could do was look at this woman and feel the weight of her life pressing down on him. She hadn't just waited. She had ceased to live, freezing her world in the last moment they had been happy, refusing to let it thaw without him. Later that day, seeking air, seeking an anchor in this surreal new reality, he walked next door. Mr. Henderson was still there, ancient now, sitting on his own porch swing, watching the world with clouded eyes. He had been a friend of Elias's father. "I knew you'd come back," the old man said, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. He didn't seem surprised, as if Elias disappearing and reappearing 40 years later was a perfectly normal event. "Always told Clara. That boy's too stubborn to die." Elias sat down heavily in the wicker chair opposite him. "What happened here, Bill?" After they sent the letter." Mr. Henderson stared out at Clara's perfect, silent house. "What happened?" "Nothing happened. That's the point." The old man's words began to paint the picture that Clara could not. He spoke of her profound, silent grief. He told of the formal memorial service in the town hall, where she had sat in the front row, dry-eyed and resolute, refusing to accept the folded flag. "People felt for her, you know," Henderson said, his gaze distant. "For the first few years, she was a tragedy. The poor girl who lost her soldier sweetheart. Young men came calling. Good men. Teachers, farmers. She was polite. She thanked them. And she sent every single one of them away." He described how, as years turned into a decade, the town's sympathy curdled into a kind of weary pity. She became poor Clara, the woman who couldn't let go. She kept her job at the library, she maintained her parents' house after they passed, and she waited. Her waiting was an active, all-consuming thing. It was in the way she kept the shutters painted, the way she replaced the porch swing chains when they rusted, the way she tended the marigolds every single spring. After 20 years, Henderson sighed, people just stopped trying to understand. She was an eccentric. A fixture. The woman in the house where time stopped. She never spoke of you. Never had to. The whole house was a monument to you. Every clean window, every polished piece of furniture, it was all for you. Elias listened, and a new kind of horror bloomed in his chest. It was the horror of a debt he could never repay. He had been a prisoner of men, of concrete and steel. But Clara, she had been a prisoner of hope. A hope he had unwittingly created and which had, in turn, consumed her entire life. He had wanted her to be happy. Instead, he had become the centerpiece of her temple of sorrow. He walked away from Henderson's porch feeling like a ghost haunting his own life. He wandered through the town square, past the new digital clock on the bank, past storefronts that were completely alien to him. He saw teenagers laughing, holding hands, living the life that had been stolen from him and Clara. He was a man out of time, an artifact returned to a world that had no place for him. He carried 40 years of darkness in him, a quiet brutality that had become part of his bones. How could he possibly fit into this pristine, preserved world she had built? The boy she was waiting for, the bright-eyed, 18-year-old soldier full of easy smiles and cheap promises, that boy was dead. He had died somewhere in a nameless cell a long, long time ago. Elias was just the shell that had carried his name back home. He sat on a park bench, the cold iron seeping through his clothes. He was at a crossroads. He could see two paths, both of them leading to a different kind of pain. The first path was to play the part. He could step into the shrine she had built, become the living ghost of the boy she remembered. He could try to pretend that the last 40 years were just a bad dream, and they could try to pick up where they left off. It would be a lie. Every smile would be a performance, every touch a betrayal of the men he had actually become. It would honor her vigil, but it would dishonor them both with its falsehood. The second path was the truth. The brutal, devastating truth. To tell her that the boy she waited for was gone forever. To admit that he was a stranger, a broken man who didn't know how to live in a world without walls. This path risked shattering the one thing she had held onto, the very foundation of her life for 4 decades. It might destroy her. It might destroy what little was left of him. He thought of his years of captivity. Survival had been about one thing, enduring the present moment to get to the next. You didn't think about yesterday, and you dared not dream of tomorrow. You focused on the single breath, the sip of water, the sliver of light under the door. It was a life stripped of everything but the raw mechanics of existence. He had returned from that, only to find that Clara had been living her own version of it. Her life had been stripped down to a single, defining principle, waiting for Elias. He looked at his hands. They were scarred and calloused, the hands of an old man who had seen too much. They were not the hands of the boy in the photographs on her mantel. He could not be that boy. The greatest disrespect to her sacrifice would be to pretend he was. The only way to truly honor her 40 years of waiting was to offer her the broken, honest truth of who he was now. He made his decision. Not in a flash of insight, but in a slow, grim acceptance of reality. He stood up from the bench and began the walk back to her house, back to his impossible future. Each step was heavier than the last, a final march toward the most difficult confrontation of his life. He found her in the backyard, tending to her roses, her movements slow and deliberate. She looked up as he approached, a question in her tired, blue eyes. He didn't try to find a gentle way to say it. The truth was not gentle. "Clara," he started, his voice steady, a commander's voice, used to delivering hard news. "The boy you've been waiting for, the one in those pictures on your mantel. He's not here." She straightened up, her hand on her lower back, a garden trowel clutched in her other hand. She just watched him, her expression unreadable. "He didn't make it back," Elias continued, the words tasting like ash. "Not all of him. They took him apart, piece by piece, over a long time. They left the scraps. What you see, what's standing here now, is what's left over. It's not him." A tear, a single, silent drop, escaped her eye and traced a path through the fine wrinkles on her cheek. She didn't sob. She didn't cry out. She simply absorbed the blow, as she had absorbed every other hardship for 40 years. "I know," she whispered, her voice so quiet he barely heard it. "I'm not the girl you left behind, either. That girl was gone a long time ago." In that moment, the shrine crumbled. The museum became just a house. The ghost in the uniform and the girl with the prom dress faded away, leaving 2 old, tired people standing in a garden, surrounded by the wreckage of a life they never got to live. He took a hesitant step toward her. "I don't know how to be the man you waited for," he confessed, his voice breaking for the first time. "But I can learn how to be the man who is here now. If you'll have him." She looked at him, truly looked at him, not at the memory he represented, but at the weathered, broken man standing before her. A small, fragile smile touched her lips. It was the first genuine smile he had seen. "Elias," she said, her voice finding a new strength. "The man who is here now is the only one I want." 6 months later, the autumn leaves on Maple Street were a riot of red and gold. The pale blue shutters on number 214 were gone, replaced by a warm, welcoming gray. The plastic was off the sofa. New pictures were on the mantel, nestled among the old ones. They were clumsy photos, taken on a phone. One of Elias and Clara on a bench, another of them laughing with Mr. Henderson. Elias spent his days in the garden. He found a quiet purpose in the soil, in nurturing life from the dirt. He learned the names of her flowers, the difference between weeding and pruning. His hands, once trained for weapons, were now caked with earth. He was learning to build instead of dismantle. They didn't talk much about the lost years. They were a shared, silent scar. Instead, they talked about the weather, about what to have for dinner, about the stubborn squirrel that kept stealing from the bird feeder. They were building a new life, not out of grand declarations, but out of small, ordinary moments. 1,000 tiny, mundane bricks of now, laid one on top of the other. One evening, they sat on the porch swing together, the chains making a soft, rhythmic creak. The air was cool and crisp. Elias looked over at Clara, her silver hair glowing in the twilight. She wasn't the vibrant girl he had left, and he wasn't the brave soldier who had promised to return. They were something else entirely. Survivors. He had spent 40 years in a cage of concrete, waiting for his life to begin again. She had spent 40 years in a cage of memory, waiting for hers to resume. They had both been prisoners. But now, sitting on this porch, the gentle weight of her leaning against his shoulder, he finally understood. Home wasn't a place you returned to. It wasn't a past you could reclaim. It was a small, quiet space you built with what you had left. And for the first time in a lifetime, Elias Vance felt like he was finally home.